So I wanted today to talk about wrap up Gulliver's travels. We did not meet last Thursday to go over the ending part of part one. So I wanted to touch base on that specifically, any questions that you have from the study guide, make sure that I address those for you before we move on to the romantic period, which we're starting this week. So I want to do that. Before I do that, though, a few kind of updates. One is that I just sent out this morning, especially for seniors, a notice about how I've decided to do the wall in my classroom. If I know that most of you, well, all of you were never my students before, but maybe you have older brothers and sisters that I had years ago. Every year since 2004, which was our first graduating class, I always let the seniors paint the wall in my classroom. And if you want to see all of the walls, I put them together on a slideshow here, but it's basically how we spend March, April, May, like especially on Fridays, a little downtime. We make sure we do the most of the work at the beginning of the week so that we have maybe an hour on Fridays to paint. And I think it's a good stress reliever for seniors, but obviously we can't do that this year. So this year, I still want to continue the tradition. Last year, we didn't really get to do that. You'll see in the slideshow that 2020 is there, but they never really got to finish their blocks. So I wanted to make sure that all the seniors knew that we're going to do a wall this year. It's just that you're going to have to make your block at home. Do it on some, cardboard, do it on some poster board, piece of paper, whatever. I put the dimensions here for you so that it will fit right there. And so we'll have a wall of posters this year instead of the actual painting on the wall. So you can go through this slideshow and see what different people have done over the years. You might also get some surprises because there's a couple teachers that you might know who were my students way back when, and I found their blocks and put them on there just so that you could see and have a little fun with what those grown-up people did when they were, in high school. And then we're going to have an installation celebration in May. So you can set that up on your calendar. I've already cleared it with the school. We can't have everybody come in at once to put up their posters. So over like a Friday, Saturday, we're going to have drop-in kind of celebration. And so I'll have little goodie bags for you, and you can come and put your poster up where you want on the wall. And I'll have class of 2021 already painted up there for you so that we can still do it. And I think when we take a picture of it, nobody will be able to tell that it wasn't painted on the wall. So this is not a grade. This is just to continue a tradition, to give the seniors as much normalcy at the end of the school year as possible. So you don't have to participate. It's not for juniors. They can do it next year. But if you would like to do that, then I'm just letting you know now so that you could start getting your materials together and figure out what you want to put on your block. If you do, whatever you want to put on it, and get it together so that it's ready for May 7th and May 8th. So anytime on those 2 days, you'll be able to drop in and we'll celebrate you as a class. So I just wanted to mention that all the info is here. I put it on the stream so that if you're interested, you can go back to it and find the information specifically on the size of the image so that it will fit right on a block. So I did that for you. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we get started on today's material is the midterm. The midterms were all graded last week. I think I finished them all by Friday. And I think there was mixed results. I feel like overall, most people did well. There were 200 or 300s across the board. There were people who just nailed it all the way across and they have hundreds. Then there were some people who struggled to answer some of the questions. So what I want to say about that is that we have another exam and it's at the end of the term. It's going to cover everything from Paradise Lost to the end. It's going to be the same drill. It's the same kind of exam. The department made the exam. I adjusted some of the questions and sort of customized it to the things that we emphasized in this particular section of the course. And the same thing is for the final. It's set up with the same short answers, the same essay, the same kind of setup, just with the second half of the material from the term. So if you had any issues with the midterm, I would recommend clearing those up for the final. You know, I think the lowest grade on the midterm was in the 40s, and that's, 20% of your overall grade. So if that happened, or if you, even if your grade was okay but not what you wanted it to be, my advice to you is to do a couple of things here in the second half of the course material. Make sure that you have good notes. I don't know, I don't explicitly say take notes from your textbook. I don't explicitly say take notes from the lectures, but you should be. That's just good student practices. Am I going to look at your notes? No, I'm not going to collect your notes. Do them however you want, but it will show up on the exam. The other thing is, make sure that you are catching up with material. If you're out for some reason, most of you that are here right now don't have issues with attendance really. But if you're watching this later, if you sometimes don't make it to class and you do the formative for attendance, but you never quite get back to watch the class period video, you're missing a lot of material. I'm trying to emphasize things that I know are on the exam, things that I know will help you with the discussions, and things like that when I talk about the material in class. There's no way I can talk about everything in these reading assignments because they're lengthy, but I'm trying to pull out and highlight. You're still responsible for the whole piece. So, sometimes there are questions about something that I might not have emphasized in class. So if you're kind of hit or missing it, or maybe you have a friend who wants to improve in class and you want to encourage them, then you could tell them, come to class more frequently, or at least make sure that you watch the videos of class because they're always posted. So those would be my two pieces of advice. If you have notes and you still didn't do as well as you had hoped, then I think you need to up your notes game. I did notice that some people took like a normal amount of time, I would think would be 3 hours on the midterm. Some people had like 10 hours logged in on the midterm. I'm kind of assuming in my mind that what happened was they started it, left it open, and I don't know, took a nap or went to bed, or I don't know what. It should not have taken you 10 hours to do that exam unless you didn't know any of the material and you had to go back and backtrack on everything. But just keep in mind that the final exam is structured the exact same way. So, you know, notes are good and notes can help you with the exam. I feel like the people who made hundreds and in the A range generally took between 3-4 hours to do the test. I'm assuming because they were, comfortable with the material and at least had notes that they could go back through here and there. So, are there any questions about the midterms? I did give feedback on some of them, not all of them, but I did give feedback. There's an opportunity for me to give feedback on individual answers. And there's also an opportunity for me to give feedback on the test as a whole. And so I sometimes did that, like especially if, you seem to be doing well and then one of the questions kind of like dropped out from under, I kind of explained or, put a reminder in there. The two things people struggled with the most, I think, were the idea of the romance, like we see in Sir Gawain. Some people just wrote, it's when people are in love. So that's not the literary definition and certainly not what we talked about. And then it was just in my mind just now what the other issue was. Oh, no, maybe it will come to me. I can't remember what I saw. Um, oh, the other one was humanism. A lot of people had a really simplified version of humanism, and I read on some of them where, that's a Renaissance concept. I read on some of them where the student had the idea that humanism was when people stopped being religious and started focusing on people. And I think that's an oversimplified explanation of humanism because humanism does not supplant religion. It just brings up the idea that humans have some power, not just God, over their own lives. So, like, God helps those who help themselves, kind of an idea. So, humanism and religious belief can coexist, and they do coexist. So, some people kind of got a black or white idea about that, and I just wanted to correct that, and I did. in the feedback too on some of those tests. So most of the things that we study are areas of gray and not just all, black and white. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I don't see anything in the chat about the midterm. I'm working on the papers. I think they should be finished this weekend. So, you can see how your essay turned out. I'll return them as I finish them. So as they're graded, those will get back to you. All right, I'm going to go to Blackboard. If you have your Blackboard open, the new unit is present, and I'm going to go through that in a little bit. But first, so you can kind of go over here to course content and be ready for that. The Romantic Period is Unit 4. Only 2 more to go after this. And so I'll go through that in a little bit. You could have that handy. But before we do that, I do want to wrap up with good old Captain Gulliver and kind of go through the study guide with you in case there are any elements of the work. Well, we really only read part 1, but if there are any elements of the work that you want me to speak about today, I'm going to talk in some general terms while I'm waiting for you to put question numbers up there. So just let me talk about the piece as a whole. Last week when I was talking about chapters 1 and 2, I focused on that section by going through some images just to talk about the different events of the first part. And so I wanted to leave it open for discussion, all of the study guide for today. So if you start thinking about any of these that you want me to talk about a little bit and sort of put on the record, then you can go ahead and post in the chat either to everybody or just to me which ones you want me to talk about, and I will be glad to. So if there's any of these that you're confused about, or you kind of get it but you just want me to spend a little time developing it a little bit, then just go ahead and put those items listed in the chat and I'll get to them. I think the main things that you need to understand about part 1 of Gulliver's Travels is sort of the political landscape, and the discussion that you have to do this week is it next week? There'll be a question about Gulliver's Travels that you need to answer, and I think it's this week. And it's about how is it satirical? So what is Jonathan Swift trying to do? This book is read on a simple level, like it's a funny story about this guy who ends up in this situation where he's way larger than all of the Lilliputians and what happens and how he learns about their society. But as he learns about their society, the people of the 18th century would have started to realize that he's closely mimicking elements of their own society, specifically religion. The big Endians and the little Endians represent religious differences. And there's also the other, what's the other one that they have in terms of, hold on, it's down here on the study guide. Big Endians and little Endians. Oh, the Slamexan and Tremexan political parties represent the 2 major political parties in England at the time, the Tories and the Whigs. You probably studied those in world history, I imagine. And then there's the Blefuscians and the Lilliputians. They're on 2 islands that are really close to one another, and they represent England and France. So if you can keep those 3 things in mind, then you can overlay that with European history and kind of see what Gulliver was trying to satirize. For example, with the eggs, right? So there's this comes up in, I don't know, chapter 4, I think. There's this explanation of big Endians versus little Endians, and it's about Endians, not Indians, Endians. It's about what side of the egg you should crack on a hard-boiled egg, to open up the shell. And it's ludicrous to think that there would be a division between, like, who cares how you open an egg? And so that's an example of satire, because Swift is trying to say it doesn't really matter what you believe in as long as you're a good person. And besides, a lot of the religions are very similar anyway, and it's all, one God. So, it doesn't matter which end of the egg you crack on your religious belief, as long as you, are loyal to it. And a lot of them are really similar in their tenets. So it's sort of a mockery of the division between Catholics and Protestants that was going on during this time of the Reformation. So, that is one thing that is an example of satire in this work. So one of your let's just go to the discussion question. I think it's for this week. This week is number 6, I think. Yeah. So number 6 says, in what way does Lilliput represent British society? So that would be one, that's like an example of one way that he is satirizing British society using the story. We know that Swift is one of the writers most associated with satire, so this would mean that within the text there are examples of veiled criticism of his own society. So where do you see one or two clear examples? So go back and quote, what's he targeting? So you have to bring up real history in connection with this fictional piece. What is he trying to say about society? So I don't know what your background is on that history. So I did put some links in down here that might help you with this week's discussion, just in case you need a refresher on that. I think people can take European history AP. I think probably everybody's already had world history. So if you didn't go into a lot of detail about this time period in England or this time period in general, you might want to just do a little background before you come up with the connection between what's going on in Lilliput as Gulliver sees it and Swift's, criticism of his society and the satire of the government, religion, war, stuff like that. So those are there for you this week. I don't see anything in the chat about the study guide, which surprises me because there's a lot of questions on the study guide. Gulliver leaves after a series of events that at first are perceived as helpful to the Lilliputians, but they ultimately tried to get rid of him. And he does leave. He finds a ship, he fixes it, like a human-sized ship. He fixes it up, and with the help of the Blefuscians, yeah, and he leaves, but that's just book 1. So he goes back to England. He kind of like, he has stolen some of their animals, and so he puts them on display, like the little tiny horses, and he goes back to England and displays them. And then he goes on another voyage. So I've already explained in the introductory materials the 4 different journeys that he goes on. So those are there. All right, number 11. I don't know if you mean 11 on chapters 1 and 2. Oh, 3 through 8, okay. Okay, so number 9 and number 11 I see there. Okay, so number 9 says, what's Swift satirizing about how young girls of England are made corrupt? So almost everything that happens in Lilliputian society is also something that happens in some way in British society. So we have to kind of like overlay the entire story onto the experiences during this time that Swift would have experienced. So when we talk about young girls of England, now made corrupt, they mean like unmarriageable, that kind of thing. So let me look at my notes here. So the idea is that girls they're in Lilliput sort of gossip, and they talk about stuff that they, that are beyond their innocent scope. And so they're kind of foolish. And he says that that makes them sort of unclean, and they're interested in beauty and ornament more than they're interested in the development of their minds. So I guess you could say folly, right? Like, he doesn't mean corrupt like in a sexual way. He just means that they become worldly before they need to, worrying about how they look and how skinny they are and what jewelry they're wearing and all of that sort of thing. And I think that we can bring that all the way into today's society. I mean, at what age do little girls start dressing more like adults or like teenagers? And, now there's a tween thing. And, when do we let kids just be kids instead of gossiping and thinking about adult things when they're a little bit on the young side? So that's what he means by that. Number 11, what satirically does Swift note about the real meaning of speeches praising the lenity and tenderness of a monarch? So remember that in Swift's time, there's kind of the criticism of the throne, especially. We talked about how this is near the time of the American colonies and King George and all of that sort of thing. So whenever something that is praised happens, then it seems more noble to the Lilliputians. So the idea is that a monarch is supposed to be generous and kind. And so that's a criticism of the monarchy in Swift's time that was not. And so there's a lot of rebellion that starts happening out of this time period in history. So the speeches praising the monarch, in this case, it's the emperor, are there to show how a leader can be, compassionate. And it's a slap in the face of the monarchy in Swift's time. Almost every little thing. I mean, I know that if you studied this time in history in your world history or European history classes, it was probably just like a passing thing. I know you probably didn't delve into it for weeks. So for the discussion, I think it's good if you go into as much detail as you can, but you don't have to spend hours studying European history in order to do that. There's some links that might help you, but that's for the history department to fill in. But almost every little thing that happens in this episode of book one is kind of something that was happening in Swift society, and even some things that we can see happening in our society still, like the corruption of youth and so on and so forth. Also, you might also think about, I don't think I put this on this. Oh yeah, I did put number 14. You might also think about, in what ways is Lilliput an ideal society? I mean, as much as they can be criticized for certain short-sightedness and they're sort of insular and a little warlike, there are elements of their society, specifically, where's my copy of the text? Specifically in chapter 6, where they talk about like their customs and some of the ways that they do things. They're not driven by time. We saw in the beginning of book one that they don't even know what a clock is when they see one. So they're not driven by time. So there are some things in this society that we could say are ideal. And, it'd be kind of nice if our society wasn't as driven by time. We can even see that in virtual learning, right? Like, isn't it better to get your assignments at the beginning of the week and then work on them throughout the week? Or is it better every day to wake up and have an assignment posted that's due that day, and then the next day an assignment's posted that's due 3 hours later? I mean, that's really being driven by time, and our school day is driven by time. right? And, learning as a concept isn't really driven by time. So it's weird that we put all these time constructs on everything. The drive-through in the restaurant. It's weird that we are if it's longer than 5 minutes, we're like, oh, they took too long to get my food. So, I mean, I think that our society is driven by time, and I think Swift was noticing that. So there are some things that are idyllic about Lilliput, and that's something to think about too. I don't see anything else in the chat. Is there anything else that you want me to talk about from the study guide? Sometimes specific things from the study guide will be on the exam. I don't know if you noticed, but on the midterm, some of the quotations from the study guides were the exact ones that were on the midterm. So I'm trying to, as much as possible, get you thinking about those things before you get to the midterm. I'm not trying to give you fresh new material on a midterm or the final. All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed reading Gulliver's Travels. I think it's one of the more enjoyable pieces that we can read because you don't have to look a lot up. And it's kind of fun and fanciful and, kind of a cool little story and, get you thinking about what would happen if I was amidst a bunch of people that were, what, 1/8 my size or 1/7 my size. How would I handle that, and how would their society be different from our society? All right, I'm going to switch gears then and go into the Romantic period and move into our next unit. So over here in Blackboard, you can see, let me walk you through the unit. I set all the units up the same way. So unit 4 looks a lot like unit 3, 2, 1. There is an important note, however, and that is that the PDF that we were using for the first half of the course finished. It's 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 a sort of a 2-book textbook, and now we're moving into the second book. So I put really big at the beginning of this unit, here's where you can find the PDF for book 2, and so the rest of the term will be using this PDF. And so all the page numbers listed of your reading assignments will go with this PDF that's right here. I recommend downloading it. I find, at least on my computer, that I can scroll through it faster and find pages faster than if I leave it in my Google Drive. It sort of glitches and I have to wait, and I'm impatient. I'm impatient. So this is the new link to that PDF. It is set up. It's in my drive, so you should be able to download it. Why is that's the wrong link? It's this one here. I'll fix that link. There's my notes. But really, this is just this is the old textbook, and this is the second half. So it's the one with the map on it right here. I recommend downloading it, keep it on your desktop or whatever as we finish off the term so that you're good to go with that. Also, in terms of content for this unit, there's an introduction here that you should read through, just an overview of the Romantic period, Romanticism, they'll call this period sometimes. And I'm going to go through some of that in a PowerPoint. I have a PowerPoint to go through with you today about the Romantic period. But I've been including an image each time of London just to show the progression of the city a little bit. The objectives are here. They're pretty much the same objectives that we work with all the time, but they're focused here specifically on British Romantic literature. This is kind of a short unit. I had to reduce this unit a little bit after the winter storm when I was reconfiguring everything and changing the number of discussions and all of that stuff. So a couple of things I had to pull out of this unit, but all the page numbers that are listed here, you need to know. You need to read the material. Wait, what? It says I need access. Okay, yeah, I'll fix it as soon as we're done. I'll fix it as soon as we're done. I think I put the wrong link to the folder instead of to the actual PDF. but as soon as we sign off, I'll do it so you can check it in a little bit. So this is grouped into the 3 days that we will be working with the romantic period, the 3 class days. So for Thursday, this is the material for Thursday. The background material, there's material about each one of the authors, and then there are pieces that I'm going to talk about. This is all for Thursday. Then this is all for next Tuesday, and this one is for next Thursday. So, you know, kind of keep that in mind. You do need to be responsible for all the pages that are here. So you should do notes on all of those pages. I will talk about the key elements of those readings when I have the class period for it that's assigned to it on the calendar. But, you know, your responsibility is notes on all that stuff. So I put the pages in here. These are the pages of the PDF, by the way, not the pages of that are listed in the image of the textbook. Same as first semester. So this Thursday, we'll be looking at 3 of the Romantic poets, Smith, Burns, and Wordsworth. Then we'll have a look at the 3 big names in Romanticism, which are Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Those are just the, you know, 3 kings of Romanticism. And then we'll read 1 essay from Mary Wollstonecraft, which is a vindication of the rights of women. And we'll just be reading the introduction to that. It's maybe 4 pages long. The whole thing is a much longer pamphlet, but we'll just be reading the introduction for next Thursday, I think that will be. There's some background information here about Romanticism that you should read through. The discussions are listed here. So 7 and 8 are already up in discussion. Those don't come into play until, let's see, we have 6 due this week. We have a week break. So as I start to talk about essay number 2, we don't have a discussion next week, but then 7 and 8 are coming up in the middle of April. There are only 10. We started off with 12, but I reduced that after the Stormageddon. So we'll just have 10. So we're halfway there. And so 7 and 8 will come from this unit. We'll go through those topics when it gets closer to time to do them. Here's where I always link to the lectures. So after today, when I post it on YouTube in our playlist, I'll also highlight it here and give you a link to that YouTube. So those are always there at the bottom. And then the other materials. So that's where you can find the textbook again. I'll fix the links in a few minutes here. And also the introduction to the Romantic period slide deck that I'm about to go through. So I'll take the last few minutes of class to go through some background on the Romantic period. And you have that slideshow right there under other materials, I think I called it. So the Romantic period, this is not a period where everybody was falling in love, like one of my students put on an exam a few years ago. I don't think there's ever been a period where everybody was falling in love. Everybody. Okay, so some historical considerations. First of all, we're moving into the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in terms of timeline. We've been going through chronologically, so that makes sense. In American history, it's sort of like early American history time, right? So we're not going to study American literature, it's a British literature course, but this is the time period when, you know, the nation is forming, and that's somewhat of a factor for Britain because of the colony situation and so on. There are a lot of debates about the abolition of slavery. The slave trade has been going on for almost 100 years at this point, the trade triangle. So that is definitely a debated topic. And just for reference, it was 1807 when slavery is outlawed in the United Kingdom, in Britain. It wasn't until 1865 that slavery was outlawed in America. So just kind of keep in mind, there's a big gap between when slavery was abolished for the people that we're studying, the writers that we're studying during this unit, and when the United States abolished slavery. The French Revolution is happening at this time, so there's a lot of ideals that are being challenged and replaced. And we also have the shift from the agricultural society to an industrial one, even more than we did with the 18th century. Laissez-faire is a term that you probably have studied since, I don't know, 6th grade or something, in terms of the attitude toward labor, because we're having more of an industrial situation with workers and factories that are getting larger and larger, using steam power, using equipment, child labor, unfair wages, working hours and conditions that were deplorable. There's this laissez-faire attitude of the owners and the people in the middle and upper classes that, you know, well, just let them survive however they can survive. You know, we're all just trying to survive. And so the idea is sort of let it alone. You know, there are more than enough poor people. So if you die, then, you know, we can always get some more. And so as a result of that, the poor suffer. They can never increase their wealth. They can never try to pull themselves out of their labor situations, and the wealthy prosper off the backs of their labor. I think we could argue that that still happens today. The term romantic is important to understand, and really it goes back to the same idea that we saw with romances in the Middle Ages. And so it's about an ideal, not about love. When we say that something is romantic, we mean that it's like sort of at its epitome of perfection, in the sense that, you know, like a proposal could be romantic. It doesn't mean that it's filled with love. It means that it was like ideal. It was perfect in that way. So it's important to remember that when we see romantic with a capital R, we mean the time period where people wanted to pursue an ideal in lots of things, art, writing, and they questioned a lot, what is ideal? Because that's an individual thing. So in the writing, we'll see that a lot. So this is a period that we don't have named after a monarch like the Elizabethan era or the Victorian era that's coming up. Instead, it's named after literary qualities, artistic qualities, which means that art and literature were at the forefront. And so we have a lot of works that we attribute to the Romantic period. There's a revival of the medieval romances like we saw with Gawain, and classicism, which is ancient texts. So the writing of the Romantic period is sometimes overstuffed with references to these periods because they were a little bit obsessed with going back to a simpler time. And in their mind, the simpler time was medieval or, you know, ancient. So, you know, they tried to incorporate some of that into their pieces. So lots of times there'll be allusions to those time periods when we talk about Romantic literature. It's a big time for nostalgia. You know, if your time is not ideal, then you look back to an ideal time. And so people were looking back fondly at the past. So it's important also to remember that we've named these periods after the fact. You know, like the writers of the time period didn't say, oh, let's be romantic. They just wrote in reaction to their society and their thoughts at the time. Later, we look back and we say, oh, well, compared to the Victorians, they were romantic. They were, you know, in this ideal mindset. They were trying to achieve the ideal. And the Victorians actually named them almost as an insult. You know, like if you're a romantic, then your head's in the clouds all the time. You know, you're probably artistic or have artistic sensibilities, sensitive to things. And so the Victorians that come later, like the next generation, it's kind of like, you know, how millennials will call people boomers. And, you know, I'm a Gen X, but, you know, like we'll criticize millennials. And it's kind of like that. So the Victorians went and said, oh, those sentimental romantics, rolled their eyes at them because their parents and grandparents were in that period, and they were like, oh, they were so romantic. And Victorians saw themselves as more pragmatic. So, it's kind of an insult. All right, when we get to the literature, this is important to note, Romantic era literature, especially for the discussions that come with this unit. Eclecticism, I did put links on this PowerPoint, so if you want more information on these different belief systems, you can click on them and get like a little background. So eclecticism is the acceptance of the idea that different people perceive the world in different ways. Nowadays, we would probably call that diversity, or like just accepting the differences of others, but that's what they called it back then, eclecticism. There's also the rise of the female voice. We're going to read during this unit an essay that was written by Mary Wollstonecraft about the rights of women. This is the spot where we start to see women standing up and saying, wait a minute, we have something to contribute to society besides having children and, like rearing them. And so there's this blue stockings movement in Britain that you can read about if you click there. But basically they're, the voice of women in revolt, or at least questioning society, their role in society, and bringing that to the forefront. With poetry, we see nature as a character almost, that a lot of poets speak to, not just something that inspires humans. So it is inspirational, nature in the Romantic era, but in some ways also there's a lot of apostrophe where the poet says, oh, sunshine, and goes on about the sunshine as if they're speaking to them as a character. I think we probably assume that poetry is an overflow of emotion. There are a number of poems that you need to read for Thursday, so you can look for that quality, these two qualities in those readings. This is a big one. I would probably put a star by this fifth bullet, which is the glorification of the simple and the ordinary. Instead of things being having to be extraordinary in order to be celebrated, it's about looking at the little things, a flower, a blade of grass, a simple scene, and seeing it as something worth writing about in a poem. Individualism and alienation, sort of self-explanatory, but the romantic character and writer is kind of a loner. They, that's why I put that picture at the very beginning of the slideshow. It's a famous image. Oh man, I don't want to know that. Well, you can go back. Is the guy on the mountain? He's looking out. So individualism, and that goes also with the idea that there are these individual eclecticism, that there's these individual variations of perception. And, I'm allowed to go off into the wilderness and think of those things on my own. A lot of first person speakers, which dramatizes the role. A lot of, I went to the meadow and I was talking to the forest and stuff like that. Gothic novels. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Gothic. They do emphasize that in the unit, but I took some of that stuff out. That's some of the stuff that I took out. But Gothic novels are more toward the sort of horror, questioning science kind of realm. Frankenstein is written toward the end of the Romantic era. So Gothic novels I put as a link here in case you want more information about that, but we're not going to be emphasizing it with our readings this term. And prolific production of literary. As we've seen throughout history, there's just more and more and more literature compared to when we go back to Beowulf, and there were basically 4 things that you could read from that time period. Now there's just huge abundance of written material. Printing presses are a lot more common, and it's less expensive to purchase books. So here's a concept that is important, and I would probably link it to the idea of the Romantic era, with an asterisk or something. If you have to narrow the Romantic era literature down to one idea, it's probably this, ars gratia artis, which means art for art's sake. You have probably seen this before. If you've ever seen a movie that was from the studio MGM, they have it in their logo right here. And it means art for art's sake. And you know, in the opening credits, there'll be this in the lion roars. But art for art's sake is just what it's pretty straightforward. It means I'm not doing art for any other ulterior motive except to express and create art. That I'm not trying to, like Jonathan Swift, make a point about society, or like John Milton, make a point about religious belief and how human beings should act. So a lot of the literature that we see is just for the beauty of the words, just for the beauty of the image and the metaphor, and not because there's some sort of societal connection necessarily. Art for art's sake is what that means. All right, the last little part here just goes through some different writers of the time period. You should know who the main Romantic writers were. We're not going to be reading all of them, but we will touch on a few of them. I'll tell you which ones we're going to read here. Mary Wollstonecraft, we'll be reading an essay from her. William Wordsworth, we'll be reading a few pieces from him. But you can see all their portraits are like, you know, contemplative, brooding, you know, sort of moody and isolated people. There's always in their portraits like a real, in art we would call it chiaroscuro, which is there's a dark background and something's highlighted and super, super bright. And so Shelley will be reading some Shelley. Keats, they're always thoughtful looking, right? Oh, I was reading from this book and now I need to contemplate nature and think about what I'm going to write next. George Gordon, Lord Byron, they're all like this, right? They all have that senior portrait pose. We'll be reading some by Byron too. So I just wanted to introduce those to you. Do you have any questions about the basics of the Romantic era before I wrap it up for today? Okay, well, for Thursday, you need to read the background from the textbook on the Romantic period. Also, you need to read the pieces by Smith, Burns, and Wordsworth, because I'm going to talk about those on Thursday. And if you go to the readings right here, you will see all the page numbers. So this chunk right here is for Thursday. This chunk right here is for next Tuesday. So you need to make sure that you've read all of those different pieces. You don't have to read everything by all the authors, just the ones that are listed here. But I just couldn't fit all the page numbers on the calendar. Maybe I'll try a little bit later. I will, as soon as I dismiss class, I'll go ahead and fix this link so that it goes right to the book and you can download it. And I'll make sure that you have access. If by 9:30 that's not up and working, send me an email and let me know, but I'm going to test it, so it should be fine. All right, any questions about your reading assignment for Thursday or anything else? All right, then I will see you here on Thursday to start talking about Romantic period poetry. Have a good day.